Thanks everybody for coming. I was very worried that nobody would, and feel much better now seeing all your lovely faces. So this paper emerges from over 10 years really working as a senior curator of anthropology at the Horniman Museum and Gardens in South London, with a responsibility for collections from the African continent, and reflecting quite a lot on how my sense of what that role is and the responsibility that it entails have changed over the last 10 years. So as Rodney said, I've been here a year now, and this paper is really framing a book that I'm writing that's reflecting on the sector in the 70s to the late 90s, and in particular colonial durabilities that are consolidated in these years post large-scale political independence and post-colonial migration. And I'm interested in them because I think when we think about decolonisation in a museum context, we often look back to the Victorian heyday of imperialism around the 19th century. And that's where we situate our questions around what ethical best practice looks and feels like. But it's actually in the 70s to the 1980s that some of the ways that we think and the languages that we use today really become consolidated. And they become embedded in policy and practice and professional ideas of what working with a collection like that looks and feels like. So I'm really interested in how those endurances become kind of professionalised, because I think that they really situate some of the difficulties that we have in the present in understanding our relevance. The ideas are incomplete, and I really value and honour your feedback at the end, so thank you. So just to talk a little bit about this is the World Gallery. I don't know if any of you have been to the Horniman, but it opened in 2018. And it was self-consciously imagined as a museological return to anthropology. So it was a time when galleries like this have been, and they continue to be, distancing themselves from the discipline of anthropology and becoming much more reflexive around the history of a collection like this and the colonial durabilities that surround it. The gallery's just been described as quite striking in terms of the volume of objects on display and its aesthetic. It's got these kind of oak veneer cases. It's also really, really overwhelming. And so I'm trying to understand kind of where we were coming from when we were curating this space. This is what you read when you come in: discover the beauty and variety of the world's many cultures and learn from the many different ways that people understand and describe the world that we all share. So I've been reflecting on how the gallery came together and the aspirations that underpinned it. Before it was called the World Gallery, it was called Being Human, before we became aware of the 2015 British TV series about ghosts and werewolves. And this speaks to an underlying humanist aspiration, so to return to anthropology as a levelling discipline committed to respecting and valuing other ways of being in the world. And I've been thinking back and recording how it was within this self-positioning, there was this firm internal narrative that being human would serve as an anti-racist space. So I'm interested in thinking with and about what that means. This was repeated during meetings, in offices, in conversations where the aspirations for the gallery and what it might achieve were developed and tested in this enclosed safe space for those working on the project. And at this conceptual level, anti-racist intention was wrapped up in a version of kind of global conviviality, drawn along these unifying themes and relatable experiences such as caring for the dead, sitting down for a meal and bringing up children. And the mythology that underpinned this was that visitors with preconceived intolerances based on cultural difference would be challenged through finding that they shared experiences and values with people in cultural contexts that are unfamiliar to them. And this version of public value found its way into funding applications, into planning documents, outlining how the new gallery would be of benefit to the Horniman's local communities in South London. And the museum was really quick to highlight links with institutional ambitions to diversify its audiences, a key priority for funders. So you can see how these ethics kind of become situated within these sort of self-articulations of value. For example, the business case made to the Heritage Lottery Fund promised that the gallery would represent the diverse nature of London's population, with objects of significance on display from all corners of the globe. But a closer inspection highlights how the gallery was actually oriented to the museum's existing core audience of a mostly white English middle-class families. And the narrative emphasis in these planning and funding documents was on values and encounters with the familiar, rather than having one's own culture and identity reflected or feeling represented and heard, and this dominates in the curatorial approach. So the reception to this gallery has been quite mixed. but critiques since its opened highlight how addressing these needs of a white English audience so directly and specifically has overlooked the needs and expectations of the significant numbers of visitors who encounter their own personal and intimate histories in the space, or expect to find those intimacies but do not. And reflecting back, it's clear that the rhetoric and the conversations we had surrounding the space, that it was developed and instrumentalised from the point of view of museum professionals who had not ourselves experienced racism, but yet for whom the idea of what anti-racism is and how it needs to be addressed felt quite certain. And it's this misplaced confidence, this ethical certainty, that I really want to address today. What does it mean to self-declare anti-racism in a professional space that's itself both a product and tool of colonial knowledge production? What informs that self-positioning, and what new forms of power does it create? And I'm interested in this because at the moment those self-declarations of personal and professional ethics are something that we encounter repeatedly in museum spaces. These are statements that were made in support of the protests in support of Black Lives Matter in 2020, and they have really underpinned an institutional kind of need and desire and responsibility, I guess, to sort of say this is where we sit, and this is what we think, and these are our ethics. And despite language of the present inferring a radical departure from what came before, what interests me is how many museum professionals working with this colonial heritage have often seen their work as sitting in critical dialogue within that same heritage. And the way that we trace this or frame this ethical positioning sits in response to a particular politics at the time. It doesn't come from nowhere. And I'm interested in how that self-articulation, what that tells us about the politics that surround us in the present. So I'm going to be focusing today on the terminologies around anti-racism, multiculturalism and ethnicity within the institutional and professional context of the 1970s and 80s, and the critiques surrounding these terms by global majority artists and writers. And this sits within the significant work on colonial endurance within post-colonial contexts, but oriented in this case towards the way such endurances permeate and are obscured by good intentions. What are the limits of good intentions? This is just a little bit of the sort of theoretical framework. So it's old, but I'm really influenced by Paul Gilroy's excellent work on institutional anti-racism in the Greater London Authority. He was writing in the 1980s. And I think what's so important from that is that we know that, from Gilroy, that anti-racism isn't one thing. It responds to a particular political and social context. It's culturally contingent. And in particular, it's the case for institutional and professional languages around anti-racism that are declared by people who themselves have not experienced it. And what strikes me is that despite this cultural contingency, it's nonetheless often conjured at a professional institutional level as ethically complete, as a sort of a reality that we're grappling with. And I'm really interested there in Francis Nyamjo's work and thinking around completeness as a form of colonial endurance. So this Western projection of complete and whole ideas and positionalities. And I'm really interested in the implications of this on ethics. So in the articulation of moral complexity through confident self-positioning and the sort of the moral capital that surrounds that. So I'm going to start in 1976, 9 years before I was born. Because it's a year of multiple self-articulations or non-articulations of anti-racism. So the first is it sits between these two elections, 1974 and 1979, when the National Front were visible, and the anti-fascist movements that were reacting against that were very, very visible in the streets, in the papers, and on the radio. So it's a time where languages of racism are very visible in public space. It's also the year of the publication of the third iteration of the British Race Relations Act, which was the first time structural racism was acknowledged at policy level. And this meant there was increased funding for new community relations officers to speak up for marginalised communities as a kind of increased sort of, at government level, an increased visibility of structural racism. It was also within the arts sector the year that the Arts Council and Community Relations Commission published a report called The Art Britain Ignores, which was researched and written by Nassim Khan, who was a journalist and a writer. And it was the year that the Museum Ethnographers Group was founded, which is the UK's primary subject specialist network for researchers and museum professionals working with ethnographic, anthropological and colonial era collections. And I was the chair of MEG until May last year, and the archive of MEG is sort of what I'm drawing of here, because it really speaks to the way that people in the sector were self-articulating their sense of social responsibility. So the idea to create a group representing museum professionals working with global anthropology collections was first posed at a meeting in May 1974 at the Horniman, interestingly entitled Museum Ethnography, a Reassessment. And this was speaking to a concern that the sector wasn't managing to communicate its public and intellectual value and significance very clearly. And the meeting included museum representatives from a range of small to medium-sized museums across the UK, including a heavy university presence. The Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology of Cambridge were there. Pitt Rivers Museum was there. The Centre for West African Studies at the University of Birmingham was there, but also smaller regional museums, Sunderland Museum, Merseyside County Museum. And archives from the meeting highlight that there was a broad remit for the group. So there was this, you can sort of see some of them here, raising awareness of collections and museums and museum ethnography as a discipline. So it was kind of, there's this disciplinary framing, sharing, developing best practice, in particular around documentation. So there was a heavy presence of the information retrieval group of the Museum Association, forming links between museum ethnography and the wider museum and heritage sector, both nationally through the Museum Association and internationally, ICOM, UNESCO. There's also this kind of disciplinary crisis. What is museum ethnography? What role can and do these museums play? And this was really in reaction to the social evolutionist racist sort of foundation of these institutions, the political decolonisation in which museum professionals were operating with, and their sort of sense of like, what are we given this history? And within this was sort of defining and discussing social responsibility in a changing world. But interested in how that was sort of articulated. So despite this visibility of racism, anti-immigration, of fascism on the streets of Britain, there's this kind of vague language around the stirrings of change. So the articulation of a disciplinary crisis responded very directly. There's a kind of a vagueness. So this is just a quote from Peter Gathercole, who was an archaeologist. Some of you may know him. He's based at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and he was the first chairman of MEG. And he talks about what is the new in the situation leading to the stirrings of change today. It is, I suggest, that we see very clearly the limitations of time-honoured curatorship in museum ethnography in the light of the recent history of both museums and anthropology. In the last 30 years, museums in Britain and elsewhere have responded to changes in social attitudes towards education, towards the ideological balance between the Western and non-Western world. So it's this kind of very kind of vague idea that something's changing. There's a sort of sense of an ethical ideological balance, but not really gripping the core of the issue. In the inaugural newsletter, there's a reading list, which is quite interesting. So there's recent exhibition catalogues, Adam Cooper's Anthropologists and Anthropology, a selection of articles from Museum International, but also referenced is the Art Council and Community Relations Commission's report on institutional racism within the art sector, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about now. So this was commissioned by the Arts Council and the Community Relations Commission. And as I said, it was researched and written by journalist and cultural historian Nassim Khan. And it was pitched as the first major study into the underrepresentation of Black, South Asian and Eastern European artists and professionals within the British art scene. That included contemporary art, performance, literature, film. And a central theme of the report was recognition that Black and Asian artists and professionals in particular faced institutional racism within the sector, and that this had an impact on formal recognition and career progression. The report focused on the inequalities faced by artists themselves, but also the impact on what were identified in the report as fragile immigrant populations and communities who are struggling to build cohesive and resilient communities. So the report articulates this as a lack of cultural education for second-generation diaspora kids. This assumes a lack of access to heritage of their non-British homelands, as well as an inability to fully integrate into British cultural life, leaving them restless. The report talks about supporting artists from immigrant backgrounds, and I quote, to help build this pride, bring communities together and support a multicultural model for integration. And the report's advocating for building appreciation for what it calls ethnic arts, indicating a positive bias towards art produced both outside the West and by diaspora artists in Britain. And it uses this really heavy multicultural lens, pitching work by minoritized artists in relation to its potential role in building cultural cohesion and communicating cultural specificity. And the recommendations for greater inclusivity include the establishment of a national body to monitor and promote diversity in the arts, called the Minority Arts Advisory Service, and also increased funding for arts organisations to support artists. And what's really interesting is, as I explore, museums with ethnography collections really tapped on these funds throughout the 1970s, in particular regional museums in cities with significant post-1950s immigration, such as Leicester, Birmingham, Bradford and Manchester. I'm going to talk through some of the criticisms of this report, because it's really important to highlight that whilst the Art Britain Ignores was commissioned in response to demands for recognition of structural inequality within the arts sector, it was actually subject to heavy critique by black and brown artists in the mid-1980s. And these critiques are really useful for thinking through the inheritance of multiculturalism today, because the critiques are very similar to those that museums are grappling with right now. So the failure to collaborate with black artists when writing the report. This is a quote from Kwesi Owusu, who's a very well-known film director. And he wrote this book critiquing the report in 1986. This occurred through a reenactment of the nemesis of anthropology, whereby community invested by the state or its agencies have little or no say in deciding the use to which the research will be put. So this idea of a sort of a government agency making recommendations without speaking to anybody. Cultural management is a really important term, and particularly cultural management of the demands for the recognition of structural inequality. So this is a quote from Rashid Arain, the founder of Third Text. The policy of ethnic arts has been systematically and insidiously introduced into the system through the cultural management of the desires, aspirations and demands of black people for equal status in this society. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but essentially it's the sort of the circumvention of structural inequality by talking about kind of culture and ethnicity. And ethnic essentialism, which is related. Sivanandan, a multicultural view of society holds out that black people's problems are a matter of not having their cultures upheld, and white people's prejudice is a matter of ignorance of those cultures. And that's really important as we go on and we think about the assumptions around expertise and who has expertise within cultural organisations who are trying to find a role in post-colonial Britain. So what artists were demanding was how to ensure more black and brown people were recruited into leadership positions, whilst what the report emphasised was what the work created by individual artists, how it differed from the work by white artists, and how the sector could better accommodate it and the assumptions around the cultural and religious worlds in which it was made. And funding and support mechanisms became anchored towards this traditional or ethnic, towards art that fit into these traditional or ethnic forms that could easily be identified as from a particular part of the world, closing off opportunities for artists who resisted this categorisation. And you can see here why it is that museums with anthropology collections find themselves accessing these funds. So I'm going to talk about a few of the projects in a second that sort of sit within that. I just want to highlight again, Paul Gilroy, but in particular thinking about multiculturalism. There's a huge critique around multiculturalism, which some of you may well be aware of, I'm more familiar with than me. It was Margaret Thatcher's answer to turning far-right ideologies about race and cultural incompatibility into palatable and acceptable politics. And what that's really talking about is looking at the sort of the policies of the far right, or the policies, the sort of articulations of that there's a fundamental cultural difference and that's the issue, and translating it into a sort of, it is that cultural difference that we need to nurture in order to create community cohesion. And sort of this idea of the new racism of the 1970s and the 80s, and the idea that racism doesn't stay still, it responds very much to the politics around it, and so does anti-racism in response to that. I'm going to go back to Meg now, in the 1970s, thinking about what the response to this bigger critique is from people working with these colonial era collections. So there is limited engagement with the racialised politics of 1976 in Meg's founding documents. I want to turn to those instances where it is more present, because it is. These are examples of two quotes by Meg's second George Banks and third Lempole chairman, and the characteristic of the way in which this is addressed. They advocate for the role of ethnography museums as cultural translators. It's a softer approach than that presented by the Race Relations Act, based on building mutual understanding of fundamental cultural differences through collections. So a very kind of classic, should we ask as ethnographers whether such laws as the 1976 Race Relations Act improve or harm race relations in this country? Is more friction created by the existence and implementation of Race Relations Acts than if such laws did not exist? And the answer is this kind of rhetoric of understanding. So, quote from Lempole, by making the public more aware of current anthropological thinking and the productive capacity of ethnographic collections. In this way, we can contribute to increasing levels of understanding between communities. Ethnography can contribute to racial harmony in urban areas and represent one part of the world to the other. So these are kind of familiar ways of thinking, but I'm trying to sort of demonstrate how they're sat within this kind of multicultural lens, of which there is a very visible and loud critique at the very time that these professionals are speaking and writing and thinking about their responsibility in terms of this reassessment. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So this is the first one. So this is a project that is based in Leicester Museum Service. It was led by Julian Nicholson in the 1980s, established in 1983, called Indian Arts and Crafts. And it's one of the first examples of museum programming that I can find in the archives that was created to engage directly with what was termed racial prejudice. So not this kind of stirrings of change, but sort of directly relating to it and spoken about intentionally in the documentation. In particular, and I quote, in response to the problems faced by inner city immigrant communities in Leicester. There's this underlying concern in the way that this project is articulated with the stagnation and loss of traditional cultural forms and the need to, I quote, regenerate esteem and identity within immigrant communities. And the programme included a wide-ranging and ambitious public programme of exhibitions, events, workshops, lectures and collaborative projects, which took place alongside the development of a new collecting policy and schools programme. And it's interesting to note that reports relating to the programme indicate a sort of a confidence in articulating the wider critique of ethnic arts. So, for example, they note that, I quote, many minority groups consider the ethnic label an insult, for it describes what they are not, i.e. Western, rather than what they are. And likewise, there's a recognition of the fact that Leicester's, I quote, Indian community was itself diverse, not least with respect to the enduring legacies of partition. But despite this kind of confidence with this language, in parallel, ethnicity is nonetheless deployed as a framework for making broad and confident statements about cultural needs or values. So, for example, in a comment about the decision not to focus on work by contemporary visual artists, it's asserted that, I quote, the Indian community in Leicester are not interested in art for art's sake, as for most Indians, art is nothing if not an expression of religious belief. And you can really see this in the development of the collections policy at Leicester Museum Service. So it draws explicitly on what it calls an ethnographic framework, seeking out collections as the, I quote, material media through which Indian communities express their distinct identity as minority groups in Leicester. And the three categories of collecting include dress and personal decoration, religious beliefs and performing arts. You can kind of see this through the language around some of the programming on the slide. And importantly, in material, ethnic identity was conceived of as a conversation between British South Asian community members and their roots on the Indian subcontinent. So including a programme of cultural field, of curatorial field collection in Gujarat state, northwest Punjab, Mirpur and Azad Kashmir in Pakistan and eastern Bangladesh. And interestingly, this was without recognition of the fact that the majority of South Asians emigrating to Leicester in the 1970s came from Kenya and Uganda. Indeed, this East African heritage was identified by Nicholson as an issue that had contributed to the loss of authentic traditions within Leicester's South Asian community. So in this sense, despite getting funds through the Minority Arts Advisory Service, through the Art Britain Ignores and that multicultural agenda, the Indian Arts and Crafts was oriented towards the development of a shared narrative of British Indian heritage that hinged on cultural forms that were recognisably Indian to a white British audience and within the professional and disciplinary space of museum ethnography and its attendant expertise, very much linked to the collection. And so despite efforts made to consult and develop networks with community representatives and groups across and beyond Leicester, the initiative offered little space to resist old or form new categories of self-representation. And so I'm interested in how, despite this sort of language of radical change and at the time a reputation built upon that, there is still the sort of the reinscription of the same categories that are already used to sort of think about the collections, because it's through that lens that ethical best practice or anti-racism is understood, and that in turn sort of limits the possibilities for what might come next that might be different. And just quickly another example, the Visions of Africa, great title, Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery in 1984. And I want to discuss this. It's a much smaller initiative. It was led by Jane Pearson-Jones in Birmingham. It was just a modest 10-day programme, but it really laid the foundations for Pearson-Jones's rising reputation as a radical, community-focused practitioner within the museum sector, and also the approach that led to Gallery 33. And I'm not going to talk about that today, but Gallery 33 is sort of imagined as kind of really pioneering for the 90s in terms of what sort of anti-racist, community-focused practice looked like. So Visions of Africa is interesting to think with, as it's self-consciously initiated as, I quote, a multicultural project and contextualised by Pearson-Jones as a response to the government commission reports on racism, including the Art Britain Ignores, but also things like the Rampton Report. Like Nicholson's work in Leicester, Pearson-Jones saw a role for museums with colonial-era collections in educating diaspora communities about their own heritage. And even more acutely, however, in this context, this heritage education was also pivoted as a response to racialised inequality. And of particular concern was the potential for the museum to support Birmingham's Caribbean community in growing cultural roots. And I just want to say here that this is a reflection of a still present incorrect and offensive narrative that emerged in the 1970s, consolidated in the 1980s through the Rampton Report, that inequalities faced by Caribbean British communities were due to a lack of coherent community organisation, resulting from a lack of cultural identity due to the transatlantic slave trade. And you can still see this deep inheritance in the way that the Caribbean is represented in museum spaces in Britain today, the lack of collections being the prominent one. But interestingly, the need for museum expertise in educating communities about their own culture is justified in the archive through the fact that Caribbean community members actually approached the museum independently in the early 1980s to request information about collections. And I just found this really interesting. These are some of the questions. Do you have any material about slavery, Benin bronzes, or Zimbabwe? There are also requests to bring out museum collections into the community to be used outside of the museum space. And these requests for independent access to collections relating to enslavement, colonial resistance and African kingdoms were dismissed as both impractical and divergent from existing academic and collections-based priorities. So rather, and I quote, a cross-cultural approach to explore techniques and processes in material culture, using collections as an inspiration for, I quote, creative art and craft work is offered. And subjects that were covered included storytelling, hair braiding, drumming, pottery and textiles, falling, like the programme in Leicester discussed earlier, within this safe, depoliticised space of multicultural arts and crafts. So I'm just going to conclude here with a few more quotes from some of these artists and writers and thinkers that were critiquing this multicultural agenda at the time, to think about some of the legacies in terms of how we thought about this work at the Horniman, but that I still think really kind of situate this self-articulation of anti-racism from a distance perspective today. The first is this quote here from Sivanandan, 1986. Multiculturalism has become the vogue. It gives the ethnic teachers a leg up and it exculpates the whites. They now know about my culture, so they don't have to question their own. Worse, they know more about my culture than I do, or think they do. And this gives them a new arrogance, based no longer on feelings of superiority about their culture, but on a superior knowledge of mine. And in the decades following the political decolonisation of the 1970s and attendant immigration of the 1970s, I argue multiculturalism provided a legitimising framework for an enduring assumption of cultural expertise within spaces like the Horniman. And what I want to highlight here is it's not only the confidence and disciplinary expertise that matters, but how it manifested as a chronic unhearing within a self-defined and often deeply felt sense of professional and personal responsibility to challenge inequality and engage in anti-racist practice. So it's just really how this confidence in expertise works as a kind of a form of adhering because of the sort of the ethical self-legitimization that underpins it. This is another quote from Kwesi Owusu. The problem is, so this is a satirical quote, the problem is that these people are uprooted, say the experts, from their own cultures, from their own traditions, and as a result they are feeling alienated and frustrated in this highly complex technological society. We shall therefore provide them with all the facilities to bring them here and practice their own traditional cultures and let them enjoy themselves. After all, they are no longer colonial subjects. And he's talking here about the mindset that sort of underpins this, what Stuart Hall calls, I think, steel pans and samosas, relating to the sort of the British heritageization of global culture. And so in this quotation from 1986, Owusu describes his frustration with British arts organisations and their portrayal of an engagement with black culture in Britain. And he clearly articulates his experience of a white saviour impulse to save black communities through cultural provision and facilitation, and the assumption that it is within institutional spaces that this provision happens best and not at home. And this, he argues, legitimises an ethical landscape that reinscribes the idea that it is institutions who have the right to define what traditions people have the right to practice and what kinds of experience this practice leads to, and how people define themselves in relation to those traditions. I'm sorry, the next slide has a swear word, I apologise. Rashid Arain, an artist. The primitive today has modern ambitions and enters to the Museum of Modern Art with all the intellectual power of a modern genius and tells William Rubin to fuck off with his primitivism, sorry. You can no longer define, sir, or classify or categorise me. I am no longer your bloody objects in the British Museum. I am right here in front of you in the flesh and blood of a modern artist. If you want to talk to me, let us talk. And I want to end with this quote from the first edition of Third Text in 1987. As Rashid Arain, the journal's co-founder and editor, published an eloquent and forceful critique of ethnic arts as a framework for inclusivity. And he writes, his piece is called From Primitivism to Ethnic Arts, and it outlines how the languages of anti-racism and inclusivity deployed by government agencies and established arts organisations were actually rooted in and reinscribed now discredited ideas based in social evolutionist frameworks of progress. Ethnic arts, he argues, was just another example of the selective valuing of global South and black art forms by European artists and organisations, rather than allowing space for marginalised artists to represent on their own terms. The phrase and wider political landscape that it emerged from was another example of global South artists and makers being manoeuvred to meet and underpin the ethical needs of European institutions. You can no longer define us was a call to action for artists to speak up against being classified or categorised on the basis of this, like objects on the British Museum, and for the art sector to stand up, engage in open dialogue and actually listen. And I think I wanted to conclude with this because it strikes me that the languages of anti-racism that we work with today are being met with this very same critiques that are happening in the 1970s and 80s. And there is this sort of an inability to learn from and understand what the implications of that are moving forward. So I guess I'm sort of talking to you here about a disciplinary crisis of the 1970s because I'm trying to work through my own crisis in terms of what it is that museums like the Horniman are for and what they have the capacity to be. So I'm going to end there. Thank you.